Helen, the importance of meditation and being connected to an independent other reality is a very important part of Eastern traditions, and perhaps more so universally than Western religious traditions. How is that, and why is that?
I think that actually in all religious traditions, there is an intimate relationship between the philosophical concepts and the embodied practices. And I think that in Eastern religious traditions, this has been more explicit or foregrounded. And it seems to me like in Christianity, if we briefly compare, one of the reasons it isn't so foregrounded is that, you'd have to go to convents and monasteries to really get the contemplative life. But in Eastern religious traditions, like say Zen Buddhism, it's something you try to incorporate in your everyday life. And in fact, if you look at the history of, say, Chinese philosophy, then one of the interesting things that you see is this kind of pulling back and forth. So one of the reasons that the early Confucians, like Xunzi was an early Confucian, wrote so much about ritual. So early Confucians said ritual is very important. Ritual helps us to cultivate ourselves, helps us to become better persons. And one reason they said that was that they felt the heat of this foreign Indian philosophy, namely Buddhism. And Buddhism had its own meditative practices, which had to do with, and that basically ultimately comes from Hinduism, yoga, the idea, it's not like Western yoga. So it has a physical aspect and it has a dietary aspect, but it is basically feeling, trying to get the sense of being interconnected, of realizing that we are individual jewels in, Indra's net, which is this beautiful metaphor from Buddhism, that there is this big sort of interconnected universe, and that we, as individual jewels in the net, we actually reflect other things. But the problem is that we, due to selfish desires, and that's always the sticking point in Buddhism, selfish desires are things that spontaneously arise, right? You see a beautiful car and you think, I want a car like that. Could I get a car like that? Let's see if the finances work out. But the problem is that that gets in the way of realizing that you don't have an individual self, at least in Buddhism is the thought. You don't have an individual self, but these desires basically make that you don't see that you don't see the big picture. So the meditative practices are there to clear your jewels, so to speak, so that you become again aware of what is important. And what is important is not whether you can get the car. What is important is that you're part of this big universe and that suffering is bad and you want to end it.
So what about the specific physicality of the meditative practice in Eastern traditions? As you said, some of it's based from Buddhism, from the yoga tradition, in which there are certain postures and stances which embody the ability, because they're not just done for exercises the way I might do it in the morning. There's deep spiritual meaning to it.
Definitely. So the physical bodily postures do matter. So in Zazen, which in Zen Buddhism is the sitting quietly, is this kind of way of sitting in such a way that is comfortable, but not too comfortable. So you shouldn't slouch. Like you should have, there's all sorts of ways to make sure your attention is just at that right level to get the benefit from the meditation. But also you can think of it broadly, like the importance of martial arts. So martial arts sounds like very different, like, you're going to beat other people up. But the idea is ultimately with martial arts is that it has this spiritual dimension, that it is a helpful means, upaya, which is the idea in Buddhism, that at least in Mahayana Buddhism, that you can use certain things, like doing chores, for example. So we think of like chores as very negative. You can see it's an interesting contrast, Studio Ghibli movies, it's Japanese movies about, say, for example, Chihiro's Spirited Away, and you see there people doing chores. So in this story, you have this girl and she cleans and when Westerners think of chores, they think of Cinderella and how bad it is. And the happy ending for Cinderella is that she doesn't have to do any chores. chores at all. And we see it as so negatively and gendered. But the nice thing is that in Zen Buddhism, chores are a way to help you reach enlightenment. You do them mindfully. Like, it's not bad to do chores. Like a menial task, you're not too good to do a menial task. So it's also that sort of thing that I think... So you have all those different things, like sitting quietly, doing chores, doing martial arts, that all are helpful means. Like, you shouldn't be too attached to them. This is another thing. You shouldn't like say, oh, I'm so great at meditation. Look at what I can all achieve. But there are sort of things that can help you, that create the mental space for you in a really concrete, embodied way, to realize you don't have an individual self, and to get you on the path of enlightenment.
How does the progress work as you begin the meditative process? What is a goal that you try to achieve?
So I have done a bit of meditation, unfortunately not much, but at first you feel like your mind really rebels. And I find that initial phase really interesting. Like, your mind is just like so busy, just getting quiet.
They have a metaphor like monkeys running wild or something like that.
So just getting quiet is already...
a monkey mind.
A monkey mind. It's already so difficult to just get past this. And you see this, again, comparatively. Like, you have, even in Christianity, say, Teresa of Avila, who says, like, when you're all at the outer side, and you're just beginning your meditative practice, it's very difficult to even quiet your mind. So eventually it could just be, and that's my modest goal, to have a quiet mind, particularly because we have so many distractions. Like, we have all these social media and just traditional media, and just, it's not just that, but also the kind of general busyness, that sort of idea about like, how can I make things better? Let's do something. So I think that's an initial goal, but then you can go deeper. And there is a sense of expertise. So people who can really make a quiet mind, who can get a sort of sense of mystical experience fairly regularly, that comes with practice. And there's so many different ways in which you can do it. Like, you can meditate on certain ideas, or you can try to clear your mind. Do
different traditions have different mystical experiences? The generality is that you lose your sense of self and you feel one with the cosmic universe, or something beyond yourself. But beyond that, does each tradition have its own content specificity?
I think that, yes, they do have, and we shouldn't just like sort of sweep that under the carpet of perennialism and say, oh, all deep down it all goes back to. So I don't think that works. I think that you do have to take these things seriously. So like, say, in Yogacara philosophy, which is a particular Buddhist tradition, there is this idea that you will ultimately realize, that your perceptions, that there is the level of your perceptions, and they are limited, and they don't reflect necessarily reality per se. So you get a sort of sense of like, the limitations of your own cognition. Whereas other religious traditions, like Vedanta, will sort of more talk about like the ultimate transcendent reality. And so there is one beautiful example, even within a tradition, of how this can change. So you have Wang Yangming, and he was a new Confucian philosopher. So he believed in an individual self, but he also believed that there was this pattern of the world. And so he thought that through meditative practices, you could sort of get a pattern of the world. And one day he was looking at this bush of bamboo, and he kept on looking and thinking, I have to discern the pattern. And he got hungry, and he got sick, and eventually he had to stop looking. And his friend also stopped looking. But then he got a sudden realization that actually, he says, if the pattern is everywhere, it's also within me. I don't have to look at the bush of bamboo. I can just look within myself. And this was a major revelation. And it's this sort of introspective meditation that can make us aware that even though you really focus on yourself, you do get a bigger picture of how the whole of reality is interconnected.